Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Debt Relief for Resilience, Reimagining Solutions for Low-Income Countries, which is organized by International Institute for International Development, IISD. My name is Marina Zucker-Marques. I'm a senior economic researcher at Boston University Global Development Policy Center, and it's my pleasure today to be moderating a discussion that I'm sure is going to be very rich and exciting. So, as we all know, the year of 2025 is a very important year to discussing sovereign debt, especially for countries that are the most vulnerable. This year, not only we have the G20 at first time in African territory, with the South African, in South Africa, with the African Union being a full member of the G20, but this year is also the year of the Jubilee, according to the Catholic faith. We are going to have the FFD this year as well, where that is going to be a prominent part of the discussion. So this discussion today, this webinar, is more than ever very, very relevant. We know that many developing countries are facing with debt distress, with liquidity pressures, and above all, many developing countries are facing a development crisis. We see that there is many developing countries are choosing between investing in their own people, investing in climate education and climate adaptation, that today is a key aspect, and instead they are managing to serve their external debt. So we see that is a defaulting on development, which, we are in the final miles towards the 2030, and to fulfill the SDGs more than ever, it's fundamental for developing countries to have fiscal space and space in the balance of payments to be able to invest where it's most needed. So today it's my pleasure to welcome four amazing panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Anahí Wiedenbrüg, which leads the IISD's work on sovereign debt issues within the Economic Law and Policy Program. She's a political economist with over 10 years of global experience in debt management and debt sustainability. Prior of joining IISD, Anahí has worked as a senior advisor to the Minister of Economy in Argentina, where she has contributed with the recent debt restructuring and also part of the multilateral discussions with the G20 and other forums. It's also my pleasure to welcome Your Excellency Yemi Osinbajo. Professor Yemi served as a Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria from 2015 until 2023, and was the Attorney General and Commissioner for Justice in Lagos State, Nigeria. Also, from 1999 to 2007, he was leading significant judicial reforms in the country. All the panelists today have a very long bio that we could spend the whole webinar discussing. So I'm going to emphasize some of the key groups they are part. Your Excellency is also part of the Climate, Debt, and Global Advisory to the Global Energy Alliance for the People and Planet, GIAP, and also a member of the recent created group, African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative. Welcome, Professor Yemi Osinbajo. Also, with us today is Guillaume Chabert, who is Deputy Director of Strategy, Policy, and Review Department of the IMF since 2021. And he is in charge of developing countries issues, including debt, and also part of the discussion on concessional financing, the PRGT, the IMF PRGT. He's also connected to the Common Framework from the start. So it's a pleasure to have him here today to give some insights on the reform of the Common Framework. And he also has been in the conceptual process of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. And before, Guillaume also worked at the French Treasury, including as co-chair of the Paris Club. And also, finally, last but not least, I would like to welcome Mahmoud who is the UN Special Envoy on Financing Sustainable Development. He's a professor of economics at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University. And among his numerous affiliations, he's also a visiting He's also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a visiting senior research scholar at Columbia Business School. He's currently leading the group of prominent experts appointed by the UN Secretary General to promote solutions to the debt crisis moving to the FFD. And he's also first Ministry of Investment in Egypt between 2004 and 2010. And also he served as a senior vice president of the World Bank Group. And also UN climate change high-level champion for the COP27. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all. So today the discussion, we are going to start with a presentation from Anahí. She's going to present her recent work report on the sovereign debt crisis of developing countries with focus on balanced payments in low-income countries. So and followed by this presentation, we are going to have the discussion, an open discussion with the other panelists. And followed by that, we're going to open for questions. So please, you can leave your questions in the Q&A, but also if you want to, orally make a questions, you will be welcome to do so. So without delay, I'm going to pass now for Anahí. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marina, for that very kind introduction. Let me just say that it is an honor from the side of IISD to have this kind of star-struck panel and to be able to be part of it as well, sharing some of our latest research pieces. So as Marina rightly pointed out, our report today, the one that we're launching officially with this webinar, is called Debt for Resilience, Ending the Debt Crisis in Low-Income Countries. And this is a report that I co-authored with Fernando Morra and with Yemi, both of whom are part of this webinar as well. I think that today, very briefly on the outline of what I'm going to be presenting, firstly, we're going to spend quite a bit of time diagnosing current debt vulnerabilities. I think in a minute it will become clear as to why we think that this is such a relevant component before we can dive into the second part of the report, which essentially is a review of the 4 main debt relief initiatives, which we've seen in the last decades. So the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, Brady, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, and the Common Framework. And as Marina rightly pointed out just now, it is an honor in that context to have Guillaume in the room being part of this conversation, as we kind of often, and he's often called kind of the father of both of these initiatives, actually. And then third and lastly, we're going to be kind of presenting our own position as to what we would like to see happening in the debt space, particularly in the context of kind of the important milestones that Marina mentioned, the kind of G20 presidency this year being on the African continent, the Jubilee Initiative, but also FFT4 coming up in Sevilla now. So let me maybe start by saying why we think that a kind of diagnosis and the right diagnosis so important to be able to kind of truly be the backbone of any debt relief initiative. Our starting point here is twofold. The first is what we witness in the global debate around current debt vulnerabilities. We observe that the debate is currently quite divided. On the one hand, you have institutions, individuals, who argue that current debt vulnerabilities can best be described as a liquidity problem, and the context being one of overall greater fragility with cases of individual defaults. On the other side of the spectrum, you have those arguing that we're actually facing a solvency crisis, and that the current situation is as grave as to kind of legitimately being able to be referred to as a systemic debt crisis. And here we have kind of 2 quite distinct quotes, one from Indermit Jill, who in the foreword of the latest World Bank report on debt argued that we're actually facing a metastatizing solvency crisis that keeps on being misrepresented as a liquidity crisis. And on the other hand, we have kind of the latest IMF report with a very nuanced position arguing that under current baseline assumptions, we're actually the risk of a systemic debt crisis appears contained, whereas if these baseline assumptions change, there is a risk of this current situation evolving into a broader debt crisis. So this is the first starting point, really kind of this quite polarized debate around current debt vulnerabilities. The second one, and here you will see Yemi Osinbajo on the left of this slide, kind of being kind of a key person featuring on this picture. The second is really kind of recognition of urgent calls coming from debtors in developing, kind of from developing countries, and arguing more and more that current debt vulnerabilities are becoming increasingly pressing and urgent. I am keenly aware that I'm talking to kind of an audience which is very well versed in kind of the current debt debates. And one thing that struck us particularly about this communiqué that came out in February, the Cape Town Declaration, is the fact that it stresses that this is the worst debt crisis that Africa has faced in the last 80 years. Well, talking to a community such as the one participating in this webinar, debt experts, it will kind of surprise many of you, or it definitely surprised us, hearing that in a way the diagnosis is this is worse than it was prior to the heavily indebted poor countries initiative. So really trying to understand kind of the magnitude of the challenge and the urgency of kind of the call for action is the second starting point as to why we thought that kind of, again, diving into the data and looking at as to how to best diagnose the current debt vulnerabilities was of the essence. So what did we do? So I think that the first kind of starting point to understand the current debt vulnerabilities definitely is, of course, kind of looking at stocks. And here, in a way, this is a very kind of well-established story. It becomes a little bit puzzling to kind of interpret the current situation as worse as the one that we've seen in the pre-HIPC years. So all throughout this presentation, you will see that we took a little bit of a long-term view, kind of when looking at the data, starting in '83 up until the latest data points that we have available. And the reason why we did that is because we really wanted to put the current situation into a broader historical perspective. What you will see on the graph on your left, where you essentially look at long-term public and publicly guaranteed external debt stocks, is that in comparison to, say, 1985, which is the year in which the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Initiative was adopted, current debt stocks remain low. So in that sense, it's a question as to why kind of African leaders in the Cape Town Declaration declared that the current situation is more pressing, is worse than it was in 1985, say. If you look at the graph on your right, interest payments, you start recognizing why there is such a kind of increased kind of call for urgency. You see that interest payments did increase significantly. Nonetheless, they continue being lower than they were prior to the HIPC initiative. So how do we make sense of kind of this call then of the African leaders at the Cape Town Declaration? We think that in addition to kind of definitely kind of high interest payments, a central part of the story is the changing credit composition. Part of the story that is already very well established is that has been a rise from 2008 onwards in private PPG debt, so private public and publicly guaranteed debt, specifically kind of bondholders, also in IDA eligible countries. A part of the story which we think is less often emphasized, however, is that there has been an increase that is significant and comparable in private non-guaranteed debt. So essentially kind of debt that is from the private sector in debtor countries. And how significantly this is the case, you can see on the graph on your right. So if you only look at PPG debt, you see that stocks still kind of remain significantly below kind of the pre-HIPC level. Now, if you also include private non-guaranteed debt and you look at total long-term external debt to GDP, you see that the total kind of external debt levels are comparable to those of 1985, which is the year in which HIPC was adopted. Now, you might still push back and say, well, this doesn't fully explain why there is such an urgent call for action today. And what we argue is that kind of this view misses two central components that kind of come hand in hand with the changing credit composition. So essentially what we are arguing is that the same debt stock is much harder to manage today because of the changing credit composition. And specifically what we argue is that with the increase of private non-guaranteed debt, it has become more difficult to manage the total debt stock because private non-guaranteed debt is both more expensive and sensitive to market conditions and has shorter maturities. This graph, we think, kind of captures the difficulty that arises with managing this kind of different debt stock with kind of different credit composition. And what you see here is essentially that whereas if you only take into account public and publicly guaranteed debt, the external debt service to exports does not surpass the LIC-DSF 10% export threshold. If you take into account total external debt, it does surpass the weak debt carrying capacity threshold of the LIC-DSF of 10% export threshold. So where does this leave us in terms of our position in the global debate? Well, we very much think that we are facing, that low-income countries are facing challenges that are as acute and complex as those that were kind of preceding the HIPC initiative, though for different reasons. We think that it is not merely a public debt problem, but that we're actually kind of seeing an acute balance of payments problem that is and kind of will continue to undermine external debt sustainability. So essentially, we are positioning ourselves kind of on the side of the spectrum of kind of institutions and individuals arguing that we are actually facing a debt sustainability problem, but that it looks different, that is as acute, but looks different to the one in the pre-HIPC era. And the last thing on the diagnosis, before I kind of go into the kind of prescription, is that we think that these debt vulnerabilities truly kind of pose a systemic risk. This is a slide that I've drawn from another kind of research piece that we've done and that we are launching in Sevilla, in Seville in FFT4, where we're looking essentially at the last 30 years of financing for development and how countries have been financing themselves. And one of the key findings there is that in addition to debt vulnerabilities posing a systemic risk, there are also other kind of sources of systemic risk, namely cuts in official development assistance and increasing trade tensions. I don't have the time to go into this here, but essentially I just wanted to flag that we think that the situation is kind of very challenging because debt vulnerabilities today are a source of systemic risk, and these are compounded by these other two sources. Last slide in terms of our diagnosis. The story I've told you just now is one that is based on aggregate level data. We think that it is a very important story to be told in the context of kind of where the global debate is at and kind of the voices and kind of calls that are coming from debtor countries and low-income countries. But at the same time, it is at least equally as important to really look at this aggregate level data. So to look at country level data. Why is this the case? Well, I think that this very, very scattered plot kind of illustrates it neatly. So what you see here is that essentially there is kind of vast heterogeneity. You still have a significant amount of countries, and this is kind of the lower left kind of corner, which have exposure primarily to kind of official creditors in their and kind of have largely PPG debt to official creditors. But you also have kind of a significant number of countries that owe to that have a private non-guaranteed exposure and who have kind of private PPG debt, and then the fourth group, which essentially has all of it. And this is very important to try to understand then kind of how the debt relief initiative that we would require today ought to look like, because essentially we will have to cater to countries with very different credit compositions. And we think this is key kind of going forward. So before turning to what we actually propose, I want to kind of make a very kind of quick pit stop in kind of the second thing we do, which is also backward looking in the report, which is essentially learning from past debt relief initiatives. So what we do in this section, as I said, is we look at 4 past debt relief initiatives, which are very different and are difficult to compare, but which we think kind of are key to look at in order to identify the relevant dimensions that kind of that compose them. Why is this the case? Well, because essentially we think that there's not so much new under the sun. The option set that we have available today to respond to current debt vulnerabilities is limited, and difficult trade-offs need to be made. So what we did by looking at kind of past debt relief initiatives is to truly identify the dimensions that each one of these kind of debt relief initiatives kind of needs to take a position on, and the thorny kind of decision points essentially that they have. The diagnosis, and this is one of the reasons why we spend so much time really looking at how we diagnose the current situation to be, current debt vulnerabilities to look like, is absolutely vital in influencing how you design the debt relief initiative. The second step is, of course, to identify the target. So kind of what countries are you targeting? What is the kind of articulation of the narrow objective of the debt relief initiative that you are going to be adopting? And then you get into the very, very difficult terrain of actually designing kind of a debt relief initiative. And here Guillaume, I think, is going to be able to kind of share kind of his ample experience in doing this in practice. But here you have to take kind of very thorny decisions around eligibility, assessment of participation. So what indicators do you use? Who has kind of the ultimate authority to make the judgment call on whether a country is in or not? What is the treatment you actually propose? And last but definitely not least, what is the legal and institutional standing of the initiative? So for instance, is it adopted by the G20, or is it more something, a solution that can look like, say, kind of a proposal for kind of enhancing liquidity via a country platform that doesn't need to be formally adopted? And of course, the question around monitoring. The second thing we do in this section is really to identify what we call kind of the necessary conditions for a kind of successful debt relief initiative. Here we identify two, what we call the creditor requirement and what we call the debtor requirement. Essentially, these are two conditions that need to be kind of met in order for the initiative, or any initiative, to kind of stand any chance of being impactful. The creditor requirement essentially captures the idea that a debt relief initiative needs to be acceptable to kind of a general sense of fairness and interest of all bilateral official creditors with exposure to the targeted countries, both in its design and its implementation. This can, for instance, look kind of like very concretely as the absence of, say, leakage of public funds to the private sector. The fact that we're focusing here on bilateral official creditors reveals a certain bias in our analysis, which is essentially our kind of conviction that we think that any debt relief initiative today, to be truly effective and impactful, would have to be adopted by forums such as the G20. And of course, it is the bilateral official creditors that have kind of the main voice there. But it also includes indirectly, more indirectly, kind of MDBs, as it is, again, kind of members in the boards of kind of MDBs that are also kind of represented, have, in a way, they have the same constituency than kind of forums such as the G20. Just to note, we don't think that the creditor requirement is akin to kind of political will. We're not saying that if the creditor requirement is met, this necessarily entails that there is going to be political momentum to adopt any debt relief initiative. But what we're arguing is that this is kind of a more minimal condition that needs to be met in order to be able to mobilize political momentum around an initiative. And the debtor requirement, I think, has become more and more important, particularly also in the context of kind of discussions around the common framework, which is essentially, it needs to be worth kind of the debtor's time. Any debt relief initiative must be sufficiently attractive for the debtor to actually participate. And I think this is kind of one area where the common framework, for instance, has faced a lot of headwinds and a lot of criticism for the kind of fairly low participation. Let me now turn, in the interest of time, in the kind of remaining minutes I have, to our own debt relief initiative. What is it that we actually propose? So it will come as no surprise to you that, given the fact that we actually argue that low-income countries are mainly facing a balance of payment problem that results in external debt sustainability problems, that our main objective is actually to avoid kind of external adjustment that negatively impacts short-term conditions as well as kind of long-term prospects. To put it kind of maybe in a very kind of simplistic manner, what we want to avoid is kind of austerity policies that kind of come at the expense of kind of short-term and long-term prospects, essentially. We argue that we should focus, in the first instance at least, on IDA-eligible countries. This is essentially a normative kind of prioritization. These are the countries that are most vulnerable at the moment, and we think they should be the primary focus, although of course we acknowledge that this comes at a cost kind of for middle-income countries. And we think that it should emulate the design of the HIPC initiative, which essentially entails that participation should be default. So countries should opt out of participating rather than opting in. One thing that we've learned in looking at kind of past debt relief initiatives in the second section of the report is that, to put it very boldly and simply, kind of a big carrot is very important for countries to be willing to kind of pay the cost of participation and actually participate. So, and this is going to start getting kind of quite, I think, debatable. What we propose is a standardized, non-negotiated net present value reduction of all official debt, which, and this is very polemic, includes multilateral debt, and that complementary measures need to be adopted depending on a country's credit composition. So let me kind of take this by parts. Essentially, we argue that for countries to be willing to apply or to not opt out, a big carrot is needed, and what we argue is needed there is essentially kind of standardized, non-negotiated reduction. Why does it not need to be negotiated? Well, because we think that part of the problem, for instance, with kind of initiatives such as the Common Framework, is that countries don't know well enough ex ante what the benefits are going to be of participating. Part of what made HIPC successful, we believe, is the fact that countries knew quite well in advance what they could expect. Now, while this kind of is kind of the carrot, we also know that in order to pass the creditor requirement, one thing that absolutely needs to be avoided is leakage. So leakage from public funds to the private sector. So that what we argue is that while there is one standardized kind of treatment to all countries, for countries that have kind of a credit composition that makes it necessary, we need complementary measures. So if with countries with kind of PPG private debt exposure, we might need a kind of debt restructuring, for instance. Whereas for countries with private non-guaranteed debt, we might need to implement CFM measures. What we also argue is that whereas there is a big kind of generous carrot in a way, we need kind of strong monitoring and also in a way kind of carrot for creditors to be willing to adopt such an initiative. And here we think that history has kind of shown that an IMF program is key to be able to do this. And let me also add here that given that our diagnosis is that we're mainly facing a balance of payment problem, the IMF is the most natural actor as well, with kind of it being part of kind of its core mandate to actually deal with BOP problems. We argue that in order to kind of decide whether or not the country can participate, is eligible, we need to kind of the IMF and World Bank need to run an external debt sustainability analysis, and the sort of country commitments that a country needs to kind of accept is, of course, the IMF program, the implementation of complementary measures, and also the articulation of nationally determined growth plans in collaboration with kind of other international institutions. And as I said, we think that this needs to be adopted by the G20 and approved by the IMF and World Bank executive boards. Let me maybe kind of end on two last slides. One thing that we think is kind of quite elegant about our proposal is that we think that it is, in a way, incentive compatible. What do we mean by this? Well, let me start with the creditor requirement. We do argue that this kind of sort of initiative would pass the creditor requirement, which, as I said, does not mean that we think that there is political appetite to push something like this forward, but it means that it does kind of take into account the different kind of the sense of fairness and interests of different creditors. Why so? Well, because essentially we are kind of we're designing it in a way that it avoids leakage. Now, the million-dollar question here, of course, is how much leakage is tolerated. It doesn't seem reasonable to say that there needs to be zero leakage, but of course, as leakage increases, the willingness of kind of the creditors is going to decrease. And here, the graph on your right, I think, is kind of informative, where we see that for HIPC participants, the external debt a year previous to this decision point was largely kind of composed by essentially kind of PPG debt owed to official creditors. You had few countries with exposure both to private PPG and almost none to private non-guaranteed debt. And for instance, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Congo did restructure to avoid leakage in parallel to the HIPC initiative. What we also think is that leakage is not only relevant to understand the creditor requirement, but also it is a proxy for participation and for the participation cost of debtors. What do we mean by this? Well, as a country's debt composition becomes more complex, they will have to adopt more complementary measures in order to be able to participate. So put differently, there is a certain set of countries that for whom participation is pretty much going to be a free lunch. Why? Because they are going to get kind of generous NPV reduction of their official debt, and they don't need to do much more other than, of course, the IMF program and the nationally determined growth plans. But they don't need to kind of do any complementary measures, which are politically costly. Now, the more complex your credit composition becomes, the more complementary measures you will have to kind of adopt, and to a certain extent, the more kind of natural selection there is going to be of countries opting out and not participating of the initiative that we propose. This is my last slide, Marina. Here we can see more or less how many kind of countries we're actually talking about. We've kind of divided countries, kind of IDA-eligible countries, in 3 tiers. We argue that for 27 countries, so with countries whose kind of debt composition essentially looks as mainly public and publicly guaranteed official debt, for these 27 countries, our initiative essentially is pretty much a free lunch, and there is no worry about kind of significant leakage because they don't have exposure to either private PPG nor private non-guaranteed debt. It is also not very expensive. And this is, I think, something that is very important to flag in the context of arguments around, like what this might mean for MDBs. It's not very expensive to help these 27 countries. And then as you go in a way up kind of the threshold, tier 2 and tier 3, you can see that it becomes more expensive. And it is for these countries essentially for what kind of complementary measures would be required. And here it is a question of how many of these countries, how bad the situation is in each one of these countries, because as I kind of tried to flag in the table I showed you when I presented the debtor requirement, here it very much will depend also on the status quo and how pressing the status quo is as to whether or not governments will be willing to adopt the complementary measures that we think are necessary to pass the creditor requirement. Let me stop there by kind of just synthesizing. We do think we are facing a external debt sustainability problem that is as complex as the one that we saw in the pre-HIPC era, though for different reasons, and it's important to understand differences. We think that kind of debt vulnerabilities are a source of systemic risk, and essentially we think that we should read the current situation as one mainly as a balance of payment problem, putting pressure on external debt sustainability. And we think that kind of the end goal of this all, which should be to preserve growth, avoid kind of austerity policies and kind of a painful external adjustment. And we think that our initiative in a way is a proposal to try to achieve this. And I'd be very keen to get your feedback and comments. Let me stop here. Thank you very much, Marina.
Thank you, Anahí. Very interesting and rich presentation. Thank you very much. And also bringing forward concrete solutions, for the debate, for international debates. Thank you very much. So I will now pass the floor to Your Excellency, former President of Nigeria, Yemi Osinbajo. And I would like to hear a little bit from you, especially, coming from the continent where we see a lot of countries in need of debt relief and being part of the ALDRI, a group that is putting, the issue of that forefront. Can you tell us a little bit what is the importance of that relief in your view? And also from the ALDRI perspective, the group has been asking for the debt relief from all the creditors in a comparable way. This is something that Anahí also highlighted. So can you tell us a little bit, the importance of that relief for the continent, and also what ALDRI is putting forward, how we can do this in a manner that is, growth enhancing, supportive of countries in a fair way? Your Excellency?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Perfect.
All right. Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. All right. Thank you very much, Marina. And thank you also for, Anahí, thank you for that very detailed presentation of a very comprehensive report. And it's incredible that you were able to do that presentation in such a short time. I just want to comment on some of the issues you've raised, also as a way of demonstrating the position of the African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative, ALDRI. You know, first, you know, I think we all accept that the G4R follows a standardized participation model, which is very similar to the HIPC initiative, with eligibility being based on the IMF, World Bank's external debt sustainability analysis. So I agree fully, the case-by-case model certainly doesn't work. I think everyone sort of agrees, and well, I mean, I'm going to listen to Guillaume on this, that the negotiations in the common framework have proven to be too lengthy, cumbersome, with a few incentives, and I think you made the point, for private creditors to participate and ultimately delivering, you know, little actual relief. And this is why, as ALDRI, we have been arguing for a comprehensive debt relief initiative where participation is based on the external debt sustainability analysis, the DSA, by the IMF and World Bank. You know, and I also believe that as part of a more standardized process, we should also think of some debt moratorium or debt standstill that applies once a country enters into a debt restructuring process. This, I think, would provide an additional incentive to speed up the process, also from the private sector side. You know, the focus, and this is a point which I'd just like to spend a moment on, the focus on IDA eligible countries, you know, that are in debt distress or high risk of debt distress is a pragmatic choice, you know, that could increase the chance of implementation. But it leaves many countries out that are in debt distress or are in high risk of it. So if you look at Africa, for example, where the initiative that I'm representing here, ALDRI, is focused on, more than half of the countries of Africa are not low-income countries anymore. So most of them would not benefit from such an initiative. And I think this is important, especially because they are experiencing, you know, a lot of the problems that this initiative ought to address. Any comprehensive debt relief initiative, in my view, should include low and middle income countries with high debt burdens. I think the issue should really be high debt burdens, you know, low and middle income countries that have high debt burdens, because really, you know, the environment and the issues from which they suffer are largely the same. There's also the questions around the shift in focus from liquidity and solvency concerns to balance of payment pressures and external debt sustainability. And of course, there is a whole debate, you know, around the distinction between liquidity and solvency, where some, I also believe, where some, including your good self, are arguing that the concept stems from a corporate world sort of thinking and cannot be transferred so easily to the country level, as a country cannot go bankrupt, you know, in that sense. Well, I'm not an expert in this field, you know, and in the technicalities, you know, and I will leave the assessment of that and how to categorize each countries to the experts. But from my limited understanding, I would say that some sort of categorization helps to think about the variety of solutions that will be needed to deal with the different situations of the countries. A country doesn't need to be heavily indebted, but could benefit from a program that lowers the cost of capital, for example, credit enhancements through multilateral institutions, debt suspension mechanisms, etc. Whereas a very strong debt exposure, or a very intense or significant debt exposure, will require some haircut or reduction of net present value of the debt, ultimately before adequate financing can come in and support the necessary investments. The D4R's initiative's main objective is clearly to ensure that financial outflows driven by reversed capital flows, increased exposure and high interest rates don't undermine spending on essential investments to address the development and climate crisis. And I believe that this is a very welcome effort to look altogether at capital flows, at debt levels, at interest rates, because this shows that we're dealing with a wide range of challenges, some also due to structural problems. In 2023, for example, 38% of developing countries, nearly half of which are in Africa, spend 10% or more of government revenues on interest payments. And as all of us will know, the net capital outflows from public and private creditors, excluding multilaterals, to developing countries were negative in that same period, 2022 to 2023. So we paid more to the creditors than we received in new inflows from debt issuance or new loans. And going to the private capital markets is also not an option for the majority of emerging markets and developing economies, as borrowing is out of reach for them, with bond yields surpassing expected growth rates already. For example, Kenya has bond yields of over 10%. That's clearly, in excess of whatever growth expectations or, growth rates are predicted. The initiative provides a substantial net present value reduction in official debt, alongside measures to prevent leakage to private creditors. And what I would like to second is the point that has been made on including MDBs into the debt relief discussions. I fully agree with that. I know that this is a controversial point, and I'd like to stress that it is utterly important, it's absolutely important to safeguard their AAA ratings. But as you clearly show in your report, large parts of the external debt of IDA eligible countries is owed to multilateral creditors. So if they're left out of any debt restructuring, this would mean that large parts of the debt remain unaddressed, which of course reduces the level of resources that could be freed up through debt relief. As the last international debt report by the World Bank has shown, multilateral lenders are increasingly lenders of last resort, bailing out private creditors with their low interest loans. And this is not what these funds are meant for. So I think that it's essential to make sure that private creditors participate in debt restructuring and take haircuts as well as other. I'm so sorry, my phone is. I'm so sorry, my phone was ringing. I'm saying that private creditors should participate, of course, in debt restructuring. And this is a very fundamental part of the suggestions that we're making, that Audrey is making. Participate in debt restructuring and take haircuts as well as other proposals, as well. And of course, the other proposals that you offer in your report that prevents the leakage of public funds to them. I think those proposals are absolutely important. Participation, I'll round up in a moment. Participation requires, an active IMF program and adherence to policy commitments that ensure external sustainability, with the IMF overseeing implementation. So while concerns over IMF oversight exist, I think its role is justified, given its balance of payments mandate in particular. The United Nations, together with the World Bank, would support participating countries in designing national development plans to guide investment priorities. I think that it will be important that these plans are country-owned and connected to already existing plans. For example, connected to the climate prosperity plans, to NDCs, national determined contributions, national economic programs, etc. I strongly support your point that such programs should be oriented towards sustainable growth and development in a way that promotes investment instead of fiscal adjustment. Finally, if I may, however, raise one question. If we want the UN and the World Bank to work together with the country on the design of national development plans, how will this work if the IMF is overseeing the program but not involved in the decisions on how the money will be spent? You know, I think I will also ask Guillaume directly here as IMF representative, would you accept such a setup, relying on your colleagues from the World Bank and the UN? I don't want to put you on the spot, you know. Or could the IMF reconsider some of its policies and adopt a stronger growth focus? You know, I think recent cases such as protests in Kenya, for example, have shown that fiscal adjustment policies simply have their limits, you know, and I'm sure that several African countries are just going to be very concerned about what the results of this will be. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I took quite a bit of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very good points. And I think I promise very rich discussions, and we are having it. So now I'm going to pass to Guillaume. And I think there are many points that I think the presentations and Professor Yemi emphasize on the, you know, the need to reform the common framework, the questions of IMF conditionality programs, and the, you know, the problem of austerity. So I would like if you could mention a little bit about this. And as you said, and as Anahí and, you know, we discussed earlier, you've been from the start, you know, as the designer of the common framework. So, you know, when we are parents, we know the flaws of the kids. So if you could tell us a little bit how we could fix this as well, and what is the political space that we can do this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thanks for having me. You mentioned my role as one of the parents of the common framework, so maybe it's about education rather than discarding the kid. But let me start with a few things. First of all, obviously, this discussion is extremely timely and important. We definitely share at the IMF the analysis on the severity of the situation. We can, you know, discuss more in depth the details of the assessment, because I may have some differences of views, but definitely you may have seen that we published last week an IMF paper, which is our contribution to the Financing for Development conference at the end of the month, where we, you know, provide our fair, candid assessment. It may not be a pleasant assessment, but we are meant to be a truth teller. So we have put everything we believe is the assessment of the situation, including the very elevated challenges to progress towards the SDGs. And we propose an action plan, right, including what we can do as an IMF. Just to mention briefly, Anahí, congratulations for the report. A lot of work, obviously, behind this work, and several aspects which I find very stimulating and refreshing, and, you know, obliging everyone to reflect. I don't agree with the proposal, and I come back to that in a minute, but I think it's very good, very useful, in fact, very helpful to have those discussions. So starting with a few things on which I completely agree. Definitely, vulnerabilities are elevated. Definitely, our view is not so much whether we should think about solvency versus liquidity, but really sustainability versus unsustainability. What we propose as action is really to differentiate situations where debt is not sustainable versus situations where debt is sustainable, but you have problems. And in that case, it would be high debt service, right? So I agree with that. I agree also that the latest developments since early 2025 have further aggravated the situation, you know, with all the super elevated uncertainty on trade policies, the cuts in official development assistance, the uncertain evolution of the global financial system, global liquidity, the needs in advanced economies to finance super high deficits, which will crowd out, obviously, the financing that may be available for other countries. All of that, we are very much in alignment. Also, I thought it was very interesting, your analysis by creditor requirement versus debtor requirement for any initiative. I just would like to mention something that you may not like, which is I think the two requirements are asymmetric. I'm not taking side, I'm just saying factually, the creators will only provide anything in terms of what will cost their taxpayers, because we are talking about official bilateral creators. So we are talking about taxpayers in creator countries, in China, in Saudi Arabia, in the US. What would motivate those taxpayers to agree to provide an effort? It's mentioned in your presentation, you mentioned interest. But what I mean here is, it may be the case that the interests of the creators may have to be incentivized a bit more for them to provide something, right? What they want is to have their money repaid, so they would provide what is necessary for them to get the most what they can get, or to get progress in the country in terms of things that may be very important for them. Climate change may be an issue. Development is certainly something that interests official bilateral creators, but you need to put a bit more emphasis on, I think, on that aspect. And by the way, just talking about that, debt relief for at least all countries that are members of the IISD is part of official development assistance. So basically what you would suggest to have, which is higher debt relief or more debt relief, would be cuts in ODA flows on other aspects. Let's be clear about this. ODA are being cut, and you have a number of countries, including my country of origin, which is France, where debt relief are the huge parts of what they count as ODA. So it's a bit of one pocket versus the other pocket, right? You will not have both. It's just factually the reality. Third, I thought it was interesting to have this analysis on basically non-sovereign debt, so the domestic private sector situation and how this private sector is being financed. And you focus, of course, on the externally financed flows for private creators. I think it's a very interesting angle. I would disagree fundamentally that you should combine the two as a single analysis. That is a problem for me in the paper, right? First, factually, when you compare the threshold under the DSAs and this combined external debt from private actors and the sovereign, I think there is a misconception here, because the thresholds have been calibrated on the basis of only the public sector. So basically, I'm sorry, you're comparing a bit apples and oranges here. But second, more importantly, in terms of institutions, a domestic private entity, a company, is meant to be viable and to reimburse external debt because it creates cash flows. If it cannot, well, it goes bankrupt. It may be bad, but that's the way it has to be, right? So believing that the official bilateral creators would be motivated to take into account the situation of the private sector externally finance in cases where this private sector may not be able to reimburse its external debt, I think there is a conceptual problem, if I may say so. Doesn't mean that the analysis is not super interesting. One thing which is super important for us is this differentiation that you have pointed out. Yes, developing countries, whatever the definition and parameter you are using, they are very much more diverse today than they used to be, if only 15 or 20 years ago. And the solution, in our view, must be accordingly tailored to those diversity of situations. That's where I wanted to mention a few things to ultimately answer your question, Marina, which is our assessment is that we're not yet in a situation where the only solution would be a systematic debt relief initiative. It may be the case in the future. We don't discount that. There are risks. But this is an initiative that would be super costly and very much suboptimal in terms of use of public funds. Globally, public funds are insufficient. We know that. So we need to be careful where we put the money that is available, right? We do believe that we are sufficiently ahead of that situation to use this money more efficiently, typically to increase new flows at affordable rates, either directly, that's ODA, that's potentially recapitalization of MDBs for MDBs to leverage onto the market, including to provide grants. Don't forget, IDA, it's $25 billion roughly coming from the donors, but they leverage onto the market and get to $100 billion. So 1 to 4. And part of that is grants. I would argue that the $1 that is available would be better placed to IDA rather than to provide the one-to-one debt relief, because it creates flows with leverage effects. What is needed, and I very much agree with what Professor Yemi Osinbajo just said, it's a question, and it's linked to your issue of BOP, by the way. It is, you need to incentivize new flows at affordable rates, both for the public sector and for the domestic private sector, by the way. So it's about cost of financing. I very much agree with that, which is linked to all the reforms countries can do in terms of indeed incentivizing private flows, improving the business environment. The official bilateral creators have their role to play by providing either directly grants or concessional finance, or to work with MDBs to indeed put in place credit enhancements where needed. So create common framework, to come back to that, that's probably the best we can have today. Is that ideal? It's not. It's not ideal. But there has been a lot of progress, believe me, over the past 18 months. It's now delivering quite fast. The fact that you don't have many countries applying is not a sign by itself. We don't see countries that would have needed a restructuring which have not come to the table. And beyond the common framework for those countries that are unfortunately ineligible, because only 73 countries are eligible to the common framework, it's worse. Those countries that have undertaken the debt restructuring outside of the common framework, that was much more complicated. So anyway, I can come back to why I mentioned that it has significantly improved. We are not there yet. Probably you know that the IMF has pushed the idea that there should be a debt service suspension during the negotiation. And it's progressing. It has been done for Ethiopia. So we have been pushing consistently since 2021. We are almost there. So it's progressing in terms of design, but it's about evolution, not revolution. I realize I'm long, so I will probably stop here. But Anahí, there is no free lunch, never. You know that, right? And the 32 billion for 27 countries, it's not peanuts. It's a huge amount of money. So just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Guillaume. And I would say, especially now with a very uncertain global economy, having the institutions in places that work is more than ever important. So thank you for your insights. I will now pass to Mahmoud, and I know Mahmoud is part of is my fellow Jubilee colleague at the Vatican Commission and also part of the UN initiative. So I would appreciate if you could tell us also a little bit, how these initiatives are pushing for debt relief. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Marina, and many thanks for your introductory remarks as well, and the excellent presentation by Anahí. Well, using the old terms used at the IMF and the World Bank Board of Directors meetings, I can comfortably say that I broadly agree with what His Excellency Osinbajo and good friend Mr. Chabert for what they mentioned. The political economy approach of His Excellency the Vice President and the technical issues raised by Mr. Chabert. However, good presentations like the one presented by Anahí could really result in a few agreements and many disagreements. And I would say, well, I know that the focus on the discussion is on low-income countries, but as we know today, by more than one measure, vulnerability matters more than the per capita income categories. If you see it from a continental perspective, the majority of the African countries are not low-income countries. They are of higher categories. And the low-income countries are aspiring as well to be out from the low-income category. So we need to have more dynamic perspective when we are dealing with issues of low-income countries on consideration, because many of the symptoms of the problem that you shared are shared, including by low-middle-income countries. But as we know, Mr. Frankenstein is not accommodating with generosity of measures. I mean, here, the common framework, we had a chat before on what to call Frankenstein, which is basically comes with the different images, including getting matters in bits and pieces to form something that we can consider as common and a framework. But many of the low middle income countries could really be happy to be considering solutions of the common framework if it is going to be responding to 5 specific suggestions that have been entertained in the discussion of the Jubilee Commission, as you mentioned, Marina, with the leadership of Professor Stiglitz and Martin Guzman and top-notch members, including the former chief economist of the IMF and the fellow citizen to Mr. Chabert. So what I would say here that let me take it into 3 stages. One is basically about what you can consider as the original sin. The original sin is not really about issues of liquidity versus insolvency, that we wait too much until we declare a country insolvent. I think it has something to do with the growth model from the very beginning that doesn't just need the help mentioned by the Vice President on more consideration by the IFIs to be more benign in their solutions to the growth model and the growth momentum, but actually for countries to rely more on the private sector and private sector solutions and more of public-private partnership, because when we see state leading work in areas that they shouldn't be leading the work in, they resort to debt. And debt here is not just the external debt, domestic debt as well. So I think the growth model, which is basically the machinery behind the achievement of development and how to invest in infrastructure, in human capital, in resilience at large, needs to be fundamentally revised. And this is very much being taken as a kind of a given. While the growth models have been varying a great deal, and we have seen better countries doing a better job even under the same shocks that we have seen from COVID to wars to geopolitics, because of the fact that they put their house in order with a better growth model, with a better fiscal discipline, and with better coordination between the monetary and fiscal policy. So I would say here, this issue about what can we expect more from our countries, including low-income countries, because I can see actually in my continent that I share with our good professor, that some of the low-income countries are considered today better credit than some of the middle-income countries. Again, it is not just an issue of categorization. The second thing, about the assumption, I worked at the bank, I worked for 4 years as well as at the IMF, so I have nothing against these institutions. I have a great deal of admiration to their work in multilateralism and the sophisticated staff as well. But assuming that it's always good to go to the IMF is not always right. Coming from Egypt, I can tell you with comfort, perhaps with bias, that the best program ever of reform that happened in Egypt was the one that was an IMF program, but without the IMF. It used the same elements of fiscal discipline, but it was for pro-growth, competitiveness, investments. That was 2004, 2008. Egypt had programs in 1991, and until now, it's in a program with Egypt. And I would say with comparison, this basically the issue of flexibility, ownership. But of course, if you are in debt need, you are in debt need. So I wouldn't really say it's always good to go to the IMF. You need really to consider the IMF as the definition comes, that it is the last resort, that you need really to do everything that you can, and then you go to the IMF, because the IMF is going to be putting you in more or less a kind of discipline that could be very close to being an emergency room or in a straitjacket with very little flexibility that you can maneuver with. And then, and I'll be very quick here, because as we speak today, Marina, the co-facilitators of the FFD shared their documents to the member states. And you'll all be happy to see great references to the IMF, World Bank, the IFI role, and all of that. So I encourage you to have a look on that. And there is very strong section on that. And actually, it's aligned very much with what we're working on. There are many things that we are considering on that, but I'll start with this issue of the common framework. Reform the G20 common framework, extend access to common framework to all middle-income countries. Let's discuss about it. I know it's more political than technical. The sophistication of the model can accommodate middle-income countries. So that needs really to be dealt with. Introduce parallel negotiations with creditor committees, and we need to do a better job with the private sector. There is a great work by Sean Hogan, who used to be working at the IMF, and Brad Setzer in the Peterson Institute about how to incentivize the private sector in doing some work at the parallel, which is being considered by the Commission, as you know, Marina. Implementation of automatic debt service stands still during negotiations, that mentioned by Mr. Chabert, and actually it's one of the proposals of the Spanish host to put that debt service clause, and actually that was raised as well in the Paris Pact. It only was limited in Paris under the presidency of Mr. Macron, that it is only for catastrophes, but here the appeal is basically for other shocks, not just natural, but could be other that could be qualified as a shock to the system, and we can really have a better identification of that. The strengthening of application of comparability of treatment, and finally, the consistent application of the IMF lending into arrears policy, which could really be used to incentivize the private sector. It is in existence and could be communicated better. And I know that there are many discussions about it because it had been used sometimes, not used sometimes. There are questions about consistency of the use of this super effective policies. I encourage you to monitor what will come as well from the team. We had the honor of meeting the Vice President, myself, and Mr. Trevor Manuel at the margins of the spring meeting. We had other people, Prime Minister Paolo Gentiloni with us, Professor Wang, and we put a list of other things, including this issue of the creditors' debtors. We have Paris Club, sophisticated people. People from a distance may think that Paris Club are hundreds of people. There are few people, but with a good network and good technical knowledge. We need to have something that could really answer to the Paris Club, that is a borrowers club, which is basically being put now in the suggestions of the FFD. Mindful as well that in the discussion, including now, and the answer by Mr. Chabert to you, is basically about countries as the major creditors or governments. We know the landscape now is including emerging market economies and including as well private sector and institution investors. And here there are issues about the significance of the Paris Club that used to be almost 40%. I stand to be corrected at the turn of the century. Today is much less than that, around 10%, I would say. So who else is doing the credit? I think we need to include them better. There are many other suggestions, including in the debt swaps, and I'm happy that the IMF came nicely to support a more wholesale approach, abandoning a piecemeal approach, and linking that to the development and the macro framework. I'm happy as well that other measures that we are considering and we've been working with have been very much aligned with the Commission work, and I encourage you to have a look at the piece by Professor Stiglitz in the Financial Times. And actually, it's very much aligned as well with what you need as end, that we need countries to be resilient because of the uncertainty of the variety of shocks. But there are many ways to achieve such resiliency, and I would say again, it's growth first, get your house in order, do better job in the liquidity, then get more sophistication when it comes to debt management, and then better collaboration with fellow borrowers. Then you get the IMF as a last resort as it comes, and then you can always do it without the IMF, but basically by just applying some of the recommendations that the IMF provides in technical assistance, capacity building, and the regular Article 4. And actually the IMF will not really be unhappy because they have already sufficient clients or borrowers from them. Having said that, I think it's very much timely, very important, and we look forward to the discussion in Seville.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. Very rich, and of course, I'm looking also forward to discuss in Seville. So moving forward, we have more 20 minutes, so I will give a few minutes for Anahí. I'm sure she had some responses to some of the comments that we discussed today here. So I'll give her a few minutes to respond, and then I will collect from around 3 questions from the audience. Please be very very straight, precise in your questions, and then finally I will give you 2 to 3 minutes to each presenter, including Anahí, so we can then wrap it up. So this is going to be the next step. So Anahí, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marina, and thank you so much to the speakers for their very valuable kind of comments and feedback. I won't be able to be comprehensive, but I do want to respond to a few that also kind of repeated themselves kind of across the 3 main kind of speakers. And I'm taking them in no particular order. So let's maybe start with kind of this question around, or kind of the comment by Guillaume around, you know, the creditor and debtor requirement, and there being an asymmetry. And I would also add kind of timing problem there. Why do I say a timing problem? Well, because clearly it is not only a question of, you know, creditors being incentivized to actually adopt it, but the adoption of the initiative having to happen before a country can actually choose to participate or not. So my reading, and here kind of maybe to give a little bit of kind of our personal background too, Guillaume already had to deal with me when I represented Argentina at the G20 and negotiating the common framework as well. So kind of coming from that background, I very much understand that there is in a way a kind of timing issue that makes that the creditor requirement is in a way kind of absolutely necessary condition without which nothing would happen. So I understand that. I do think though that, and this kind of brings us back to the comment around the fact that only 4 countries participating in the common framework not necessarily being an indicator of how well it works. I do think though that it's a very thin line to walk, and it might be the case, this is an open question, that the common framework kind of fell on kind of one side of the horse in a way, so that the creditor requirement was passed. We have an initiative which is a massive achievement, but that it came a little bit at the expense of kind of the debtor requirement actually being passed. Why am I saying this? Because I think that one thing that many of the other kind of speakers mentioned, and also Marina highlighted in her initial remarks, is I do think that kind of this very catchy phrase of default on development is something that we're witnessing. So we're witnessing countries kind of putting debt servicing kind of in front of everything else, and that kind of coming to a great cost for country citizens, but also, and I think this is the point I definitely take, also kind of in a way at the cost of global interests. So one thing that we will absolutely do is kind of make sure to be very explicit about the interests of creditor countries who essentially, as you rightly point out, are kind of putting their own taxpayers' money kind of there in order to provide debt relief. We will definitely flag what we think the common interests are that would entice creditors to participate. Maybe second point around eligibility. Let me say that I simplified a little bit what we propose in the report. So what we're saying is that IDA eligible countries should participate per default, as we said, kind of they need to kind of opt out of participation. But we are arguing that middle income countries should be able to apply. So it's not a kind of total kind of exclusion, like say right now it is with the common framework where middle income countries don't have the possibility of applying. But it's more of a kind of pragmatic initial choice. Having said that, Mahmoud, I very much agree with you on income groups not being the most relevant way of kind of categorizing countries, and vulnerability being the absolute key kind of component or question, essentially, concern. Maybe kind of on the IMF, I already said why we think the IMF should be kind of a key part of this. I think that Yemi, you mentioned, you asked a question to Guillaume in terms of, you know, would the IMF be willing to have other institutions play a role as well? That gives me an opportunity to kind of make a general point, which is, I think, kind of, and this is a personal conviction, but also kind of witnessed from the close. The IMF never, and I think it's a straw man to say that the IMF can dictate conditions on countries. The IMF can never dictate kind of conditionalities on countries. It is always a negotiation kind of between the country and, of course, kind of the IMF that comes with recommendations. And I think that the role that the institutions have there is to actually work with the country, strengthen the country, also strengthen the country's negotiation position in order to be able to have a truly kind of, in a way, homemade, home-baked, kind of nationally determined growth plan that can be then kind of also defended in cases it is needed kind of with the IMF in negotiations. Maybe last point, or like two more points on the heterogeneity. One thing that our proposal does is it tries to combine, on the one hand, this kind of standardized treatment, which we think is key in order to entice participation from debtors, with tailored treatment. So we're not saying we only need a standardized treatment, say like HIPAA. We're saying we need to combine a big enough carrot with kind of tailored treatment. And the tailored treatment very much depends, of course, on the credit composition to avoid leakage. Last point, kind of one central aspect of our report, kind of combining, in a way, private non-guaranteed debt with sovereign PPG debt, as Guillaume said. I think this is kind of a very central element of our report, although I must also say that our balance of payment diagnosis, that does not depend on kind of also including private non-guaranteed debt. And having said that, from the debtor's perspective, I think that including private non-guaranteed debt makes a lot of sense. And I always have this visual image of essentially kind of an imaginary situation, right? Of kind of creditors queuing in front of the central bank who all have a claim on their reserves. There, it doesn't really matter if the country, if it is the private sector in the country that has accrued the debt, or if it is kind of the sovereign. Because at the end of the day, all these creditors have claims on the reserves of the central bank, and the central bank governor and the minister of finance of the particular country needs to wake up every day to make sure that they have enough reserves in their central bank to be able to kind of make, to service those debts. So from the perspective of the debtor, including private non-guaranteed debt actually makes a lot of sense from a kind of practical political economy perspective, essentially. Now, I do take your point that from the creditor's perspective, it is a thorny kind of question to include private non-guaranteed debt, precisely because of what you're saying, which is essentially, it is the private sector in debtor countries that are accruing these debts. Why should our kind of taxpayers care? Which again brings us back to the kind of the asymmetry of the creditor and debtor requirement, which is a point that is very well taken. Mm-hmm. And I'll stop here in the interest of time. Thanks, Marina.
We are wrapping up, so I have two questions from the audience, and then I will pass to everyone to reply. And I see Mahmoud has his hand up, so I will be the first one to reply after I read the questions from the audience. So the first question I received is regarding the IMF funding model that has been heavily criticized, and Alex J is asking about other funding from other institutions. I think this is maybe an idea on like leveraging IMF resources and, you know, yeah, so this is the first question about IMF funding. The second question from Lawrence Schaffer is they are asking why don't global institutions like UNDP and World Bank Group and others have a comprehensive plan to provide a roadmap for developing countries to be, you know, to be graduated from, you know, developing from developed, and benchmarks from continuous evaluation. So a question on the role of development institutions on guiding developing countries towards development. And finally, they are also asking about, you know, the problem of instability of currencies and how this is affecting broadly the international financial architecture and also digital currencies. If there is any one more person from the audience that would like to make a question, I will open this opportunity now. Otherwise, you know, hold your peace, and I'm going to pass to our panelists. So we start with Mahmoud. If there is any questions you'd like to answer some of this, or, you know, general, your final words for this, I will ask everyone to be very, you know, sharp. We have 10 minutes to go. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Marina. There are no final words in this complicated topic, as we all know. And I raised my hand before getting the questions in response to what Anahí mentioned, this kind of strong general statement about the fund that cannot dictate rules or orders to countries. It's very complicated because the institutions and the IFIs suffer from a great deal of even-handedness. And we can discuss that in details. And that has implications on what to do, when, and by how much. While these institutions are apolitical, but again, there are some political considerations that could really be put, and I will not mention countries' names in particular here. And you put it as well on the negotiating teams. And yes, countries are born and are with different capacities when it comes to their sophistication and knowledge of the institutions. And in many cases, they need help and advice to help them optimizing the relations with the IFIs. So we didn't really take it like, well, there are no rules being dictated or anything like that. And actually, the best piece of advice, as I've seen it from more successful cases in dealing with the IMF, and there are many, is basically don't go to the institution while you are in a super desperate case. Because in this case, you'll be facing some prerequisites and some triggers of engagement that may be technically feasible, but politically and socially you cannot deal with. On the points raised, I think the issues about how development finance institutions and IFIs can help countries, there is a great deal as well of expectations, not just on debt, but debt and beyond, for the multilateral system to do a better job going forward, including actually the regional financial institutions. The world is getting more regionalized. We have seen the discussions during the African Development Bank that countries are trying to rediscover their neighborhoods and the neighborhoods of their institutions as well. So in addition to the IMF, World Bank, and the New York-based institutions where I'm speaking to you from today, there is a role as well for the regional institution. But again, you start by building the kind of problem that you need to solve and building capacity and borrow that capacity in order to optimize the relationship. This is my answer to the two excellent questions.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud. Now I'm passing to Guillaume, 2 minutes for this, very simple questions.
Yeah, so two things very rapidly. One, on the question on the development program, development plan, etc. I think Mahmoud put it very clearly. It has to be homegrown, right? It cannot be dictated from the outside. It has really to be owned by the authorities, the population. It's the country's plan. We can help, we can support, but definitely we are just, helping the country. By the way, the IMF has a very narrow mandate, right? We are in the field of helping countries, maintaining macroeconomic and financial stability. What does that mean? It is low inflation, fiscal in order, external account in order, and financial stability for the financial sector. We are not a development institution. Now, we believe that macro financial stability is a prerequisite, a key condition to enable development. So we support that process. And we indeed provide policy advice. We provide capacity development to build institutions, in particular in the economic and financial field. And indeed, we provide money when there is a crisis, right? Second thing is, Anahí, you mentioned big enough a carrot for the debtor. But if the carrot is big for the debtor, there is the need for having a big carrot for the creditors as well. So it's always a question of what is a carrot for the creditors, right? I just wanted to mention that. On the common framework, just to mention that the breakthrough was to have the Paris Club creditors, China, Saudi Arabia, India working together. That was a decision in principle that they would do restructuring together, contrary to the divide we had pre-2020. Now, what was missing in 2020 when the common framework was approved was a single rule book. The Paris Club, China, Saudi Arabia, India, they had their own ways. Even though they wanted to work together, there was no common rule, right? What we did for the past 2 years is to create this kind of rule book, right? It's not binding rules, but you may have seen in April that the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable published a restructuring playbook. For the first time ever in the entire history, you have the same reference on how to do. What is the timeline? What you should do in terms of when to do what all along the process. That's the first time ever in the entire history. So it's progressing. It's not perfect, but it's progressing. I know I haven't addressed the question on digital money, but frankly, that's a super complex question. I cannot do that in 2 minutes.
You need additional 2 minutes, we understand. So I'm passing for His Excellency, Mr. Osinbajo. You're muted.
I'm not sure which of the questions to answer, but I think there's a point. I think there was a question asked about whether the UNDP and a few of the other such multilateral institutions could do with development plans. I think, to be fair, the UNDP has intervened in developing, in working on development plans with several countries. I know, for instance, that they were instrumental in the transformative plan for Rwanda. They worked also on Cambodia, the development plan there. Also, I believe Ghana, quite a few others. So I think that that work already. But just for me, as a final point, I think, that it's important, and one of the things that we emphasize as Aldri is really, the fact that we are today, looking at some of these issues, not necessarily, and I think it was Mahmoud who described my view as a political economy sort of perspective. And I think that you're probably right about that, because debt relief must be seen as a catalyst for sustainable development, and not necessarily a handout. And the past shows that this approach works, HIPIC, the Brady bonds, help countries to grow, to repay and integrate. And I think we need a bold, a similar bold, modernized approach. And I think that that's really what we need to look at. I mean, yes, we can deal with a lot of the, technical issues, but one of the points that has to be made to different countries is that we're headed for a situation where, the climate crisis, for instance, links us all up, and how we address development, how developing countries, in particular African countries, address questions of climate change, and whether or not they have the fiscal space to be able to do so, may to a large extent determine whether or not the world itself is able to attain net zero by 2050. If African countries go along the same, carbon-intensive trajectory that the developing countries have grown, rather than look at, green initiatives and all of that, which obviously they cannot do with the unavailability of fiscal space. If they were to do so, this would simply hamper the world. So I think we have to look at this, and keep looking at this as a global issue, and look at the debt crisis itself as one that has a scope realizes its other objectives. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Yemi. And I think this brings us to a closing. And thank you for reminding us of the development needs and climate urgencies that we are facing. I think today we've had a very rich and exciting discussion. I would like to thank you, Professor Yemi, Guillaume, Mahmoud, for all your inputs, and of course Anahí, our host. I will pass for her to close now, but I think we have a lot of food for thoughts and a lot of real proposals for coming for the next FFD, G20. I think there is no desert of ideas. There are many ideas, and I think the key is how we can make the best of them. I will pass to Anahí. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marina. Let me say something in 30 seconds that I still want to emphasize. Let me just say that kind of the growth agenda and also kind of everything that we need to do ex ante is something that is an absolute central part of our work at the International Institute for Sustainable Development as well. I didn't get the chance of talking about it today, but we actually do a lot of kind of direct work with countries where we try to essentially empower them, because we recognize that there is a kind of very asymmetrical international financial architecture against kind of the background of which kind of these growth agendas need to be put forward. That just kind of as my final content comment. And then let me just thank kind of Marina, Yemi, Mahmoud, and Guillaume for being here. It's truly an honor to be able to have these conversations with you, and to all of the audience for having kind of remained with us for an hour and a half. And I look forward to continuing the conversation in Sevilla and in all of the other kind of fora coming up. Thank you very much.